Yeah, first of all, I would like to thank Anna, Maria, and Sandra. I'm very honored to be here, and it was long awaited, to participate in this conference. First of all, I would like to say a few words about the current situation of the Middle East. Since October 7, I'm living once again in a total daze of fear, hopelessness, and apprehension. Apprehension of receiving one of those phone calls that would make me jump out of my skin, as my sister and her husband live in Lebanon next to Hezbollah area. As originating from there, we have been here many times before, thrown in this relentless pattern of destruction. I will always consider Lebanon to be my homeland, but as a Jew, I learned to live on that edge and be guarded about what I say in both camps, as many would not comprehend why I'm mourning for all victims. I'm in grief thinking of the kibbutz family who used to fly kites over the border, wishing for peace, for the journalist Issam Abdallah, who fed all the stray cats from his motorbike, and for Dima El-Lamdani, who lost 13 members of her family in Gaza. But one has to keep faith, and it wasn't always like that. Beirut, for one, was once an idyllic, vibrant, tolerant city, and growing up there, we rarely bothered about religion, except if it meant extra school holidays. And for me, the most inspirational being I knew was my art teacher, Madame Khurshid, who came from landed gentry in Gaza. She had a fierce spirit, always fascinating, and never swayed in her opinions. She went on to run the only hotel in Gaza, allowing foreign visitors to experience the place firsthand. I would urge you to watch a documentary about her titled Malika's Hotel. It is unfortunate that since the 70s, huge, intractable division kept rising, locking us in an endless us and them rhetoric of extremism. This is compounded by the lack of historical context, as demonstrated by much of the media, too prone for biases, quick fixes, and sensational loops. I hope today to highlight one of those gaps as related to the creation of a memorial archive. I will talk here about a body of work which is in progress, titled Erasure, and it's composed of several sub-series. And one of the sub-series is also titled Erased. This body of work was born out of an experience of loss, my mother's passing in this country just before the pandemic. It relates to the double helix of erasure, one due to continued conflict in the Middle East, and the other due to the fragility of memory in the digital age. The sudden rupture of her life was met with very few carriers of memory or space for reminiscing to enable processes of grieving and commemorating. The burial, which took place 2 days after her death, as is dictated by tradition, was executed swiftly in a matter of 2 hours. On a snow-covered field, it felt so far away from our point of departure and all that we had known. My mother was the last bridge to that universe, the one who garnered all our roots, and with her passing, this whole universe extinguished in an instant, and I was left drifting. I felt as if I had stepped out of time, where a life of 94 years could dissolve into minutes. This work then grew out of tentative steps to retain a sense of control and a memory of a life, one that started in a very different world, in Tiberias, Palestine, in 1925. Her lifespan covered most of the 20th century, with all its turmoil, conflicts, and displacement, and he came just after a crucial point in 1922 for the Middle East. First, I will show you some installation shots. Both these index of objects and erased are in an exhibition titled Seeing Through Melancholia, Huzun in the East Mediterranean, taking place at the Ethnological Museum in Nicosia, curated by Gabriel Correas and Alef Adil. You can see index of objects organized, displayed as grids. One important component of the exhibition was collaborations between visual artists and poets. And for my part, I selected a poem by Etel Adnan, but also included my own Distant Ray. And this is the album for Erased. That's the poem that goes with the series. Okay. So when starting this work, there were several questions that presented themselves. How could I mark her passage and unable to recover a mode of contemplation outside of a continuous chaotic and frenetic world? How could I claim some anchoring space to resist the dissolution of time within increasingly blurred temporal parameters? And lastly, how could I resist erasure? So from a soundless house, I started to retrieve a constellation of objects which could form a timeline of her life. Photography offered the possibility to crystallize these mini sites of memory, and its silence gave the promise of visual intimacy and contemplation. I thought of it as an archive that would speak of a trail, an index of femininity, sometimes touched by Hollywood glamour, aspirations, daily grooming rituals, travels. But as I progressed, many negative gaps also appeared. The objects collected here help to mark time, and as in any collection, it offers a controlled cycle of time. Unpacking numerous boxes and suitcases, I soon realized that she had kept almost everything, including insignificant bits of threads, wool or torn cloth, and this probably was to be able to retell herself her long journey as an errant. Many things were also preserved in their original packaging for decades, as if postponed for a better future. At this point, I would just like to give some information, some context relevant to my mother, to my family history. Being born in some parts of the Middle East seems to destine you to a pattern of conflict, instability, and fragmentation. My mother, like most of our family members, experienced about 10 major conflicts and wars in her lifetime, including the Lebanese Civil War, which lasted 15 years, from 1975 to 1990. Plus all the ripple effects of World War I and World War II. It is probably not an accurate account, as so many small bloody exchanges, explosions, attacks do not warrant much media coverage, as violence in the Middle East has become too much of a common currency. And for the people living there or from there, violence becomes internalized like a slow poison, but played down and talked about in a banal manner. However, when there is media coverage, the spectral quality of endless reiteration seems to annul our memories, making different sides of conflict interchangeable and unspecified in their histories. There are some conflicts that you do expect to unfold, but others that take you totally by surprise, like the war in 2006. So there's always an element of your psyche switched on fear. And already the 21st century looms like a repetition with all the religious fundamentalism and contested territories, as we are currently witnesses in this very tragic and hopeless war in Gaza, Israel, and Lebanon. Due to the constant turmoil and borders reforming, this resulted in each generation of my family being displaced, having to retranslate themselves into a new land and culture, each time learning a new language. Starting from my grandmother, born in Izmir, who spoke Ladino, the languages accumulated to include Arabic, French, Hebrew, and English, along the many points of settlements. But due to the Lebanese civil war, there was further dispersal of the family across the globe. So starting with this powder pot that used to belong to my grandmother Regina, born in Smyrna, which was the name at Ottoman times, it sort of offers transcendence as encapsulating another place and point of departure. These other objects like eyebrow, comb, or many of these type of objects, would evoke a daily grooming ritual, but for the wedding, trousseau towels are indicative of a rite of passage, the material sign of an abstract referent of transformation of status. As Edward Said points out, migrancy and exile involve a discontinuous state of being. To talk of this inheritance, to refer to history, is always to speak of the incomplete, the never fully decipherable. To come from elsewhere is to live at the intersection of histories and memories, always reliving the primary dispersal and reassessing what constitutes our sense of identity, place and belonging, away from the point of departure. Being born in Tiberias, Palestine, into a Mizrahi Sephardi family, the fragmentation and erasure goes further and deeper. There is very little awareness that for 2,600 years there were many Jewish communities across the Middle East and the Levant. In Baghdad, for example, the Jewish community made up a third of the population, but today only 5 elders, remain. The story of these displacements was repeated across many other minorities, including Christians, Chaldeans, Assyrians, Armenians, Kurds, and Yazidis, through sometimes persecution and dispossession, but due also to the religious fundamentalism. And these histories have remained very much untold, ignored, and forgotten. It is actually, I'll go back, sorry. It is actually difficult to also imagine that for 600 years, until the World War I, all these communities coexisted in relative peace under the Ottoman rule and thrived in the many cosmopolitan cities through rich transcultural and economic exchanges. However, the decline of that empire was marked by a very dark chapter, but it is widely recognized that many of the current conflicts in the Middle East stem from decisions taken at that point in 1922 when the colonial powers when carving up the former Ottoman territories. As part of a larger strategy, the Middle East was embedded with fault lines to ensure constant tensions and conflict, thus making it necessary for these colonial powers to always intervene as peace brokers, but as well as arms suppliers. As an aside, several years ago I was involved in a conference project about Ottoman cosmopolitanism, which looked at these societies as a model of multiculturalism. So in the case of Lebanon, a population of 20,000 has now been reduced to 20. Most started leaving after the Six-Day War in 1967 when things turned sour. The main synagogue has strangely survived in the old quarter, but it is fenced off and always silent. Other traces that remain may be eroded stones with undecipherable inscriptions in overgrown fields, and sometimes, as in Tripoli, the Jewish cemetery has completely disappeared under a petrol station. There are no monuments, archives, or plaques that would unravel and speak of the presence of a community of over 2,000 years, and younger generation would of course never know. Therefore, as there are no collective sites of memory that would bear witness to that history, the onus is then transferred onto individuals to create their own archives by whichever means possible, in the hope that one day the accumulation would illuminate a path towards some acknowledgement. In Parkin's words, objects gathered by refugees provide materials through which attempts to secure continuity of personal and cultural identity are articulated. They become reminders of who they are and where they come from, and inscribed with narrative and sentiment. So here are some more selection of index of objects. The objects have been photographed in the classification mode akin to an archive and form a self-enclosed, quite hermetic world. It was important that many of these objects would have belonged to her personal sphere, and therefore very much a gendered space. So here are the endless, bits of threads and trimmings, lace patches that were kept, and a few souvenirs. Now, for the second sub-series, which is erased, I'll give a few words also of context. Also in the digital age, one would be captured, a multitude of times. The image that would, the image would probably be unactivated by any gaze after the initial thrill of capture. The act of photographic capture seems to have become an act of possession. An emotional insurance against future lostness. The billions of photographs taken every day are destined to be swallowed up in a vortex of social media, and our memory seems to be constantly under siege. Consequently, the memory of a being after their passing becomes a very fragile thing in our world, oversaturated by media and consumerism. The family ritual of reminiscing around an analog album seems to have little space in the digital age. Many factors come into play. For one, the frenetic pace of our mediatized world and its politics of quick oblivion are inherently amnesiac and have undoubtedly a profound impact on how we think and convey our experience. There seems to be a constant encroachment on our mental space and a marked absence of collective rituals to enable processes of grieving. As the ritual of reminiscing around the family album has waned, and in my case, the family dispersed, in Erasures, the image of my mother was removed from several family snapshots as if deactivated by the absence of future gaze. So here we've got a selection from Erasures, starting from early days in Tbilisi in 1939 to different sites in Lebanon, and also including images of travel with, to places like Luxor and the Great Wall of China. Sorry, I'm rushing through. So the last sub-series is Tikkun, which I will just run through, and I'll stop at this one. Tikkun is derived from the Kabbalistic notion of repairing and healing the world, and this could apply to a bouquet or a cup or a lampshade. The latter, since our home in Beirut was always lopsided and never got adjusted. As in the words of Joe Spence, photographs can help us to unfreeze, acknowledge what had previously been resisted and repressed, then let go and move on from the material being worked through. The action depicted here may seem nonsensical and absurd, but nonetheless they felt necessary as small tentative steps to repair and redress some of the wrongs and the unfulfilled wishes of a life molded by unrest, but also to point to a process of healing. As all webs or nests always come undone, but get repaired again. Okay, thank you.